And I have an incredible guest joining us here on tonight's program. She is the incomparable and the fabulous Cheryl Ring, who is a fair housing and consumer rights attorney who also happens to be an LGBTQ plus activist and advocate. Cheryl, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. I'm not sure I can live up to that intro.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. So much has happened in politics, and people are reflecting on the last 4 years, the trauma inflicted by the Trump administration. Yes, has been immeasurable. Joe Biden has now inherited a nation that is plagued with housing problems in every city, with communities and families and people trying to make ends meet. Cheryl, what is your take on the housing crisis in America, and where do we go from here?
I'm glad you bring that up because as we sit here today, 40 million people are facing eviction. And yes, one of the things that President Biden did when he was right after he was sworn in was call on the CDC to extend its eviction and foreclosure moratoria. But that really is just a drop in the bucket with respect to what we need to be doing. Number one, the problem with eviction moratoriums is that they really don't address the underlying issue if you can't afford to pay your rent. Rents continue to outpace wages. Even with a $15 an hour minimum wage, the average wage in every state in order to afford a one-bedroom apartment is $22 an hour. And
Mhm.
so that is something that we need to address at the same time. And an eviction moratorium won't address if you owe 8, 9, 10 months of rent when the moratorium finally expires and you haven't been able to save enough money to pay that off. And so an eviction moratorium is good and helpful, and I am certainly in favor of it, but it needs to be part of a much broader suite of policies beyond simply saying you cannot evict anyone or you cannot foreclose on a mortgage. One of the things I'm seeing a lot in my own practice, for example, is banks who are attempting to use the moratorium as a way to refinance homeowners into
Mhm.
predatory loans.
Right.
And that's a problem that is going to lead to another housing bubble if we are not careful. Banks are seeing that right now is you have a lot of people who are not necessarily entirely educated on what options are available to them, don't understand the moratoria, and they are offering these under the guise of this is how you save your home, when in
Mhm.
reality, a lot of homeowners have options and banks are simply not making them aware of.
It's a myriad of different problems. I love how you're pointing out that the moratorium, while in theory is wonderful and it gives people a peace of mind, what it is a dangerous band-aid. Because as you pointed out, if you're upside down, you have an absorbent amount of debt into the home that you're not able to pay. What is an extra month of incurring more debt going to do for you?
That's absolutely true. But one of the other things the moratorium doesn't address is landlords who take steps outside the moratorium, essentially illegal steps, perpetrating frauds upon courts to try and evict tenants anyway. I have multiple cases right now where I have landlords abusing orders of protection, domestic violence courts, alleging that tenants who do not pay rent are some kind of threat to the community as a result of being poor, or that if you invoke a COVID-19 protection, you are therefore a danger to other people in your building, and trying to evict people that way. And I have multiple cases like that. And the only thing, and the landlords will stipulate to this, the only thing the tenant did was either catch COVID themselves or be unable to pay their rent. And the landlord is arguing this is akin to violence against the landlord. And so not every judge is treating these with the skepticism that these cases deserve. And that's a real problem because the moratoria are designed to address you cannot evict a tenant using the eviction statute, whichever your state has. But a lot of landlords have just decided to go around those entirely.
Right, right. What do you think is the most egregious thing the Trump administration has done as it concerns the housing crisis?
A couple of things. Number one, the Trump administration's aim to gut the disparate impact rule. And for your viewers who don't understand necessarily what that is, there are a couple of different kinds of discrimination when you are talking about either race discrimination, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, or gender identity. One of those things is you can either allege disparate treatment. In other words, I treated a person differently on account of their race intentionally. And the other is disparate impact. In other words, I enacted a policy that I knew would have an impact that is different for certain groups as opposed to others. And that's really important to understand, because if I enact a policy that says I will not rent to anyone who has been evicted in their life, or I will not rent to anyone who comes from this particular neighborhood, or I will not rent to anyone who has ever been arrested, you are going to be creating a policy that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people.
Hmm.
And by attempting to gut those rules, what the Trump administration did was tie a lot of lawyers' hands and basically turn back the clock on discrimination law almost 30 years. That's something that I'd like to see the Biden administration take the lead on, restoring the disparate impact rule, and affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's the other issue that is very, really important. It was the issue during the campaign when we were talking about Cory Booker is going to come and invade the suburbs. What Trump was actually talking about was the idea that under the Obama administration, there was this idea that we should attempt to integrate the suburbs in a way that we have not done before. And that's important to talk about because we remain one of the most racially segregated countries in the world. Um,
Which is so shocking in 2021, and how
yes,
come, which is indicative of how far we haven't come. Continue.
yeah, and so we see this NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and
Hmm.
that's a real problem. People who consider themselves woke white people who say, "Well, I don't want low income housing next to me. I don't want those people." It's something I deal with in my job on a fairly regular basis. And so saying that and so the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule essentially required municipalities to say, we are going to attempt to roll back racial segregation. And when Trump was saying, well, that will destroy the suburbs, he was to allow for racial segregation, racial integration, rather, he was saying, well, we want to keep the suburbs white. That is essentially what he was saying.
Sure.
And so the sheer amount of effort he put into that, I think, is something that the Biden administration really needs to take a look at. And these both affect the housing crisis we're seeing today because generational wealth is built from housing. And so if you are prohibiting Black and Brown and queer families from buying houses, from getting into the suburbs, from building that kind of generational wealth that they can use the equity in their homes to send their kids to college, that is how you are able to build generational wealth and insulate yourselves from the housing crisis. But here, just like the last housing crisis a decade ago, the majority of people who are impacted, the majority of those 40 million people, are Black, Brown, and queer families.
Right. And speaking of queer families, very quickly, I just want to can you illuminate for our audience some of the rights that the Trump administration, excuse me, tried to roll back in the last 4 years for our queer brothers and sisters, and what would you like to see going forward in the Biden administration? What would you like to see happen in regards to the new administration uplifting the queer community?
The first thing I'd like to point out is that the trans panic defense has to go. In 40 states, it is still considered a defense to murder if your victim was trans. It is unconscionable in 2021, and I'd like to see the Biden administration take the initiative on pushing through a ban on the trans panic defense. I'd also like to see some kind of federal statutory scheme in the Fair Housing Act to sort of rectify two issues that have been overlooked for a long time. Number one, every week it seemed the Trump administration was issuing some kind of new ban on trans people in homeless shelters, trans people in the military, trans people accessing social services, trans people accessing Section 8 vouchers, all of these issues. And one of the ways that they're able to do this is because of the regulations that are the enabling regulations for the Fair Housing Act, specifically state that being a quote unquote transvestite, that is the word that is used from the original language, it should not be considered a disability. And so we've had to sort of backdoor into it in order to enforce fair housing rights for trans people. And obviously, as a trans woman myself, I do not believe that being trans is a disability, but the fact that that language is in there has made it a lot harder for those of us who are fighting for trans rights to say, well, the statute is intended to apply to us when there is an exclusion that implies, well, being trans is a disability, but not for these purposes. So I'd really like to see the Biden administration take a look at that, strike that language, and make clear that gender identity is included under the definition of sex for fair housing purposes. And yes, the Bostock decision from last year will help with that, but it really should be made clear in the housing context so that these executive orders with respect to homeless shelters in particular can never happen again.
Wonderful. Attorney Cheryl Ring, thank you so much for joining us here on the conversation. You make very salient points. We're so happy to have your voice and have you on the program tonight. Where can they find you online and on social media?
Thank you so much. You can visit me on my website, www.cherylringlaw.com. That's with an S, not a C, cherylringlaw.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter at ring_Cheryl.
Cheryl, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.